In September 1980, a massive British merchant ship was sailing through the western Pacific carrying a heavy cargo of iron ore. It was a huge vessel, modern for its time and designed to transport enormous quantities of cargo across the world's oceans. Its name was MV Derbyshire. It was an ore bulk oil carrier, a hybrid type of ship designed to transport ore dry cargo, and sometimes oil under specific conditions. With more than 90,000 tons of deadweight, the Derbyshire was at the time the largest British ship ever lost at sea. But what would make its story so remarkable was not just its size. It was the disappearance. In early September 1980, the Derbyshire departed from Canada, loaded with iron ore and bound for Japan. The voyage required crossing the North Pacific and then entering the waters of the East China Sea, a region frequently affected by powerful weather systems during typhoon season. On board were 44 people. 40 crew members and 4 family members traveling with some of the ship's officers. Among them were engineers, sailors, navigation officers, and technical staff responsible for keeping the enormous vessel operating day and night. It was a normal routine for cargo ships operating on international routes. But in September 1980, the Western Pacific was entering one of its most dangerous periods. That same week, a powerful weather system was forming in the region. It was Typhoon Orchid. This tropical cyclone began intensifying as it moved across the Pacific toward Japan. Violent winds and massive waves were being reported throughout the region. Commercial vessels operating in the area had to constantly monitor weather reports and adjust their routes to avoid the center of the storm. The Derbyshire was also tracking this information. Records indicate that the ship's captain was aware of the typhoon and attempted to alter course to avoid the worst conditions. This was standard practice. Captains typically tried to steer clear of the most intense parts of a tropical system. But the open ocean can be unpredictable. Even far from the eye of the storm, waves generated by a typhoon can reach enormous heights. Some can easily exceed 20 meters. And when such waves strike ships loaded with iron ore, a cargo that is extremely heavy and dense, the situation can become critical. On September 9, 1980, the Derbyshire sent its last recorded communication. After that, silence. The ship simply disappeared. No distress call. No emergency signal. No debris immediately found. 44 people had vanished into the ocean. And for many years, no one knew exactly what had happened to the largest British ship ever lost at sea. In the days following the Derbyshire's last contact, maritime authorities began to realize that something was wrong. The ship had not arrived at its destination in Japan, and no further communication had been recorded. On international shipping routes, delays can happen for many reasons: bad weather, route changes, or mechanical issues, but the complete silence of a vessel of that size quickly raised concern. The Derbyshire had simply disappeared in a region of the ocean known for violent storms. No distress signal. No survivors. No visible debris. For the families of the crew members, the absence of any explanation was devastating. For years, there was not even certainty about what had actually happened during the ship's final hours. At first, many believed that Typhoon Orchid had been directly responsible for the loss of the cargo ship. The theory seemed plausible. Ships had been destroyed by tropical storms before, and the weather conditions recorded in the region were extremely severe. But there was something that troubled investigators and maritime experts. The Derbyshire was a massive and structurally robust vessel, designed to carry extremely heavy cargo such as iron ore. Ships of this type, known as bulk carriers, have thick hulls and compartments designed to withstand enormous pressures during long voyages. If a ship like that had simply been destroyed by waves, debris would normally be expected to appear floating on the surface of the sea. But there was nothing. The ocean had swallowed the Derbyshire completely. For years, the disappearance of the ship remained a mystery. Initial investigations were conducted, but without physical evidence from the wreck, any conclusion was limited. The absence of concrete proof led to several theories. Some believed the ship might have been struck by enormous waves, now known as rogue waves, unusually large waves that can appear suddenly in the open ocean. Others suggested that structural problems might have contributed to the disaster. But without locating the ship on the ocean floor, these ideas remained speculation. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continued to demand answers. For years, they insisted the case needed to be investigated more deeply. Many believed the disappearance of the Derbyshire could not simply be attributed to bad weather without a thorough analysis of what had really happened. That pressure eventually led to an important decision. Almost 2 decades after the ship vanished, an expedition would be organized to search for the vessel on the ocean floor. And when the Derbyshire was finally found, what investigators discovered would completely change the understanding of the disaster. For nearly 20 years, the Derbyshire remained lost on the ocean floor, with no one knowing exactly where it lay or what had caused its disappearance. For the families of the victims, the silence was almost as painful as the loss itself. Without wreckage, without survivors, and without a definitive explanation, the sinking had become one of the greatest mysteries in British merchant marine history. But the pressure from the families never disappeared. Throughout the 1990s, relatives of the crew organized campaigns and pushed British authorities to conduct a real search on the ocean floor. They wanted concrete answers. They wanted to understand how a ship of that size could simply vanish without leaving a trace. In 1994, a major deep-sea search operation was finally organized. Using modern sonar technology and remotely operated vehicles (ROVs), teams began scanning a vast area of the seabed south of Japan, where it was believed the Derbyshire had sunk. The depth in that region exceeded 4,000 meters. Exploring such a location was not simple. The pressure on the ocean floor is crushing, visibility is minimal, and any investigation depends on specialized equipment capable of withstanding extreme conditions. Even so, after long sweeps across the seabed, something began appearing on the sensors. Metal fragments. Massive structures scattered across the ocean floor. It was the Derbyshire. When the first images of the wreck were transmitted by the submersible vehicles, investigators were finally able to see what remained of the ship. The hull was completely destroyed and spread across a vast area of the seabed. The way the wreckage was distributed told a story. The ship had not been torn apart by an explosion or by a collision with another vessel. Instead, everything suggested that it had sunk rapidly after suffering catastrophic damage to its forward section. The initial analysis revealed something important about the type of ship the Derbyshire was. Bulk carriers, ships designed to transport large quantities of raw materials, have massive cargo holds covered by large steel panels known as hatch covers. These covers must be extremely strong, because any failure can allow seawater to enter directly into the cargo compartments. If seawater floods a hold loaded with iron ore, the additional weight can increase rapidly and compromise the vessel's stability. And if several compartments begin filling at the same time, the ship can sink within minutes. As the investigation progressed, experts began to realize that Typhoon Orchid likely did not destroy the Derbyshire with a single massive wave. Instead, something more specific may have happened. Extremely violent waves may have repeatedly struck the bow of the ship. This type of impact is known among naval engineers as green water loading, when large volumes of seawater surge over the deck and strike structures with enormous force. If these waves hit vulnerable areas such as ventilators, hatches, or access covers, they can create openings that allow water to enter internal sections of the ship. And once water begins entering a bulk carrier loaded with iron ore, the situation can deteriorate very quickly. As the images from the ocean floor were analyzed more carefully, investigators began to reconstruct, piece by piece, the probable sequence of events that led to the end of the Derbyshire. The pattern of destruction found on the seabed did not suggest a sudden and instantaneous failure, but rather a chain of events that escalated rapidly amid the extreme conditions of the typhoon. Engineers focused their attention mainly on the forward section of the ship, where several structures on this type of vessel can be particularly vulnerable. Bulk carriers have large openings and ventilation systems near the bow that allow air circulation inside the cargo compartments and provide technical access for maintenance. These points are normally designed to withstand severe navigation conditions, but during a typhoon the scale of the forces involved can exceed almost any scenario anticipated in design. What investigators began to consider was the following scenario. As Typhoon Orchid advanced, the Derbyshire likely encountered enormous waves repeatedly striking the bow of the vessel. Some of these waves may have swept completely over the deck, dumping massive volumes of water onto the metal structures and equipment located at the front of the ship. These waves carry tons of moving water. When they hit a ship's structures, they behave almost like hydraulic impacts with immense energy. The technical hypothesis that gained strength was that these waves may have damaged bow ventilators and access hatches located at the front of the vessel. If these structures were compromised, seawater could begin entering internal spaces in the bow. At first, that water ingress might have seemed limited. But the problem is that any flooding in the forward section quickly alters the ship's balance. As water enters, the bow begins to sink deeper into the waves. And the lower the bow sits, the more easily new waves sweep across the deck. This creates an extremely dangerous progressive effect. Each new wave pours even more water into the ship. And as the bow sinks further, the pressure exerted on the cargo hatch covers increases dramatically. The Derbyshire's cargo holds were loaded with iron ore, an extremely dense cargo. This type of load naturally causes the ship to sail with enormous weight concentrated within its holds. If seawater begins entering those compartments, the additional weight increases rapidly. The investigation concluded that at some point during this sequence of events, one or more cargo hatch covers likely failed under extreme pressure. When that happens, the ocean enters directly into the ship's massive cargo compartments. And once a hold floods, the ship quickly loses stability. In the case of the Derbyshire, investigators believe this process unfolded extremely rapidly. The vessel likely began sinking by the bow as the cargo holds flooded. With tens of thousands of tons of iron ore and seawater combined inside the hull, the structure of the ship began to experience enormous stresses. Eventually, the hull could no longer withstand these forces. The ship broke apart during the sinking process, scattering its wreckage across a vast area of the ocean floor. All of this likely happened within a very short period of time. Too short for the crew to send a distress call. When naval engineers finished analyzing all the data collected from the ocean floor, the picture of what most likely happened to the Derbyshire became much clearer, and also far more troubling for the global maritime industry. The disaster had not been caused by the typhoon alone. It had been caused by a dangerous combination of structural vulnerability and extreme ocean conditions. The central phenomenon behind the tragedy was what specialists call green water loading. During severe storms, massive waves do not merely strike the hull of a ship. They can sweep directly over the deck as enormous moving masses of water. These surges can weigh dozens or even hundreds of tons when they impact specific parts of a vessel. In the case of the Derbyshire, investigators believe that huge waves repeatedly struck the bow of the ship, an area that houses ventilation systems and technical access points for internal compartments. When these structures are hit by massive volumes of water moving at high speed, they can be damaged or completely destroyed. Once those structures fail, seawater finds direct pathways into the ship. At first, that flooding might be slow. But in the middle of a typhoon, nothing stays slow for long. Each new wave adds more water. The bow becomes heavier. The ship sinks deeper into the waves. And the lower it sits in the water, the more likely it becomes that new waves will sweep across the deck. It becomes a rapidly intensifying cycle. This process likely continued until water reached critical areas of the Derbyshire. As the accumulated weight of water increased, the enormous cargo hatch covers began to experience extreme pressure. These covers are designed to withstand severe conditions, but they were not originally engineered to endure constant impacts from tons of seawater carried by massive storm waves. At some point, one of these covers may have failed. When that happens on a ship loaded with iron ore, the consequences are devastating. The ocean suddenly floods into a massive cargo hold, creating an enormous additional weight inside the hull. With tens of thousands of tons of ore already on board, any significant water ingress turns the ship into a structure that is almost impossible to stabilize. The bow sinks even deeper. Other compartments begin to fail. The hull starts experiencing tremendous stress as the ship struggles against the increasing weight. In the case of the Derbyshire, evidence found on the seabed indicates that the ship broke apart during the sinking process, scattering large sections of the hull across a vast area of the ocean floor. Everything suggests that the final sequence happened extremely quickly. Too fast for an evacuation. Too fast for a distress call. The 44 people on board likely had only minutes, perhaps even less, between the beginning of the structural failure and the complete disappearance of the ship beneath the ocean. For investigators, discovering the Derbyshire on the seabed finally brought answers to the families. But it also revealed something even more significant. The tragedy was not just an isolated accident. It exposed a structural risk that existed in many similar cargo ships operating around the world. When the results of the investigation into the Derbyshire began to be released, the impact within the maritime industry was profound. What had initially appeared to be just another ship lost in a storm revealed, in reality, significant weaknesses in the design of many cargo vessels operating across the world's oceans. The Derbyshire was not an old or poorly maintained ship. It had been built in 1976, only 4 years before the disaster, and was considered a modern bulk carrier by the standards of the time. Its construction followed internationally accepted technical regulations, and nothing initially suggested that it was structurally unfit for ocean voyages. But the disaster revealed something that had not been fully understood until then. Bulk carriers, especially those designed to transport extremely dense cargo such as iron ore, had specific vulnerabilities when exposed to extreme weather conditions. The enormous size of their cargo holds and the configuration of their forward structures could create weak points when subjected to very large waves. The repeated impact of massive volumes of water over the bow, the phenomenon known as green water loading, proved to be far more destructive than many ship designs had anticipated. The investigation eventually led to important changes in international maritime safety standards. Organizations responsible for naval regulation began reviewing design requirements for bulk carriers. Among the most significant changes were structural reinforcements in the forward areas of ships, improvements in the design of ventilators and access hatches, and stricter strength requirements for cargo hatch covers. In addition, new guidelines required better protection against water ingress into forward structures during severe storms. These changes did not occur immediately, but over the following years the case of the Derbyshire became frequently cited in technical discussions about maritime safety around the world. The ship became a symbol of a broader problem that needed to be addressed. For the families of the 44 men on board, however, no regulatory change could erase the loss. Many of them had spent nearly 2 decades fighting to ensure that the sinking would be properly investigated and that the maritime world would acknowledge that the disappearance of the Derbyshire deserved real answers. When the ship was finally located on the ocean floor and the technical conclusions began to emerge, those families finally gained some understanding of what had most likely happened on that night in September 1980. The Derbyshire had not simply vanished. It had been overwhelmed by the combined forces of the ocean and structural vulnerabilities that had not been fully anticipated. And in the middle of a violent typhoon in the Western Pacific, that enormous steel vessel had become something no one on board could control. A floating trap. Today, the Derbyshire rests on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, more than 4,000 meters below the surface. Down there, where sunlight never reaches, the wreckage of the ship lies scattered across the seabed like a massive puzzle of twisted steel. Each fragment tells part of the story. Sections of the hull, structures from the bow, massive pieces of the cargo holds. All of it lying silently on the ocean floor, witnesses to a night when the power of nature and the limits of naval engineering collided in the worst possible way. The ship that had been built to transport some of the heaviest cargo on Earth ended its days crushed by the immense pressure of the ocean, far below the surface where it had been sailing only hours before. For the British merchant fleet, the Derbyshire became a historical milestone. It was the largest British ship ever lost at sea, and its story permanently changed the way naval engineers think about the safety of massive cargo ships. Investigations into the sinking led to real changes in structural design, stricter inspections, and new requirements intended to protect ships from the devastating force of waves during extreme storms. Today, many of the bulk carriers that cross the oceans carrying iron or coal and grain include additional structural reinforcements, precisely because of the lessons learned from the Derbyshire. Yet even with modern technology, advanced weather radar, and sophisticated communication systems, the ocean remains an environment where human control has clear limits. Ships are larger than ever. Engines are more powerful. But storms can still generate enormous waves capable of challenging even the strongest designs. The disappearance of the Derbyshire is a reminder that, at certain moments, the sea still holds forces that exceed anything humanity has built. 44 people were on board that voyage in September 1980. Experienced sailors, navigation officers, engineers, and family members traveling with some of them. All of them disappeared that night in the Western Pacific, when one of the largest cargo ships in the world was swallowed by a sequence of events that lasted only minutes. Today, memorials dedicated to sailors lost at sea preserve stories like this one. Names engraved in stone represent lives that were part of the vast human network that keeps global trade moving every single day. Most people will never see these ships. They will never experience the storms those vessels face. Yet thousands of sailors continue crossing the oceans every year, carrying goods between continents and confronting the same natural forces that challenged generations before them. And among all those stories, the one of the Derbyshire remains one of the most striking episodes in the history of modern maritime navigation. If you enjoy learning about real stories like this, about giant ships, maritime tragedies, critical decisions at sea, and events that changed naval engineering, leave a like on this video. It really helps the channel continue producing long, detailed documentaries based on real historical events. And if you want to follow more deep stories about shipwrecks, naval battles, legendary ships, and ocean mysteries, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the sea still holds thousands of stories. And many of them are still waiting to be told.